Yes. Yes. We figured out how to baptize little children in the midst of a pandemic. Oh my
Yay.
God. Oh, human ingenuity. What
Good
are we to
morning.
do? Good
How are
morning.
you?
Good.
Good.
Today is February 23rd. We survived 222 Tuesday yesterday, and we're here. My name is Eric Hartman.
And my name is Jessica Hockett.
Oh my God, there's so much going on always. Last few times we delved into legalness. We're going to take a break from the legalness today, even though the legalness is still going on in both of our states and around the country.
Yep.
Just because there's so much awesomeness that is happening in COVID pandemic world that we just can't ignore all of it.
I know. I feel like I can't. Everybody has their specialties, right? Like their little topic areas that they focus on. But every day there's stuff that passes by on the Twitter stream or that people send to me that I'm like, oh my gosh, that's fascinating. And then but I can't look at it right now. And then I bookmark it. And so I have these like files and files of things that I have to look at. But one thing that's nice about being connected with you and being connected with other people is that no one person can keep up with everything, right? But people have their little specialties and threads and things that they follow. So you kind of learn who to rely on for, who's the expert, the little expert on this or the specialist on that. You can always kind of go to that person and say, hey, what's going on with this topic? I like that. Networking is really what it is, right? So
It
social
is.
media networking.
Well, you're right. I mean, we can't do everything, and it's like a fire hose of crap, on a daily basis, on an hourly basis. And it's just too much. I mean, actually, for instance, because we're going to talk about Osterholm on Rogan, which was absolutely insane. And there's actually a lot of other videos doing the exact same thing because it was so insane. I was looking at YouTube. There's like, a half dozen people that are just running clips from the Rogan Osterholm interview going like, oh my God. So we're going to do that. But first, to that point, I think let's touch on a couple little news tidbits that I think fit the description that you just gave, right? And the first is this ridiculous thing that let me fix the deal here, and that is the fact that our CDC has been now officially busted. And again, we've been calling this out for 2 years or almost 2 years, but we live in an age where it doesn't really exist until the mainstream media touches on it. And here we have the New York Times, who has discovered that the CDC isn't publishing large portions of the COVID data it collects. And it's funny because I saw this, and because, I've known this for 18 plus months now, this did not surprise me. And there was a lot of outrage around this. And as you can see, there's a lot of articles around the world about this. The CDC is refusing to publish data collected on booster effectiveness for 33 million Americans aged 18 to 49 over fears it might show the vaccine is ineffective. Again, the noble lie, the sort of the manipulation and the curation of data in order to try and scare people and otherwise have them do the actions that the science feels like that they should do.
Yeah.
Debate be damned.
Yeah. Well, and when I saw this story and then the other headlines that went along with it, I thought, not only are they refusing to publish data that we know that they have, right? But they've also all along refused to provide appropriate context or definitions for the data that they do publish, right? So, I mean, I am concerned about the things that they're suppressing because they want people to get vaccinated, or they want to keep going with this multifaceted narrative that they've been advancing for two years. But they can't even get the data that they do publish correct. I mean, we've noted, and I know I've noted many times, the discrepancies between the CDC tracker, that dashboard and data that they have, and then the data that they publish elsewhere. That's been the source of a lot of back and forth with people about what the real number of pediatric COVID deaths
Yep.
is, right? So
Absolutely.
it's just such a hot mess that I feel like somebody should just kind of take, fire everybody at the agency, like, just disband or disband the agency, like take all the data and start over. I don't know, or take all the COVID data and put it somewhere else for like somebody independent to look at. I don't know. It just seems so beyond fixing right now that it's super frustrating. It's super
To-
frustrating.
Totally agree. And I think that, prior to COVID, we all assumed that the CDC performed a function, a helpful function. And they may to some degree still, but the bloom is off the rose here. These people, these bureaucrats, and the CDC is huge, and it is messy, and it is multi-leveled and multifaceted, and there's a lot of money that flows in and out of the CDC. And it doesn't have to be nefarious to be corrupted, right? And we've seen this, again, to your point, like it is continuous. It has been continuous. And just because we have, a little blip on the narrative, that sort of admits this, and it's sort of been, revealed, or they, which they're so sloppy that they even do this. They sort of, leak on themselves, and they reveal, stuff like this themselves. The outrage, again, just didn't surprise me. And everybody pounced on this. And to your point earlier, I kind of felt like, A, I know this, B, duh, and C, let them suss it out, get it out there. We push it, we amplify it. But anyway, this is just yet another example of these bozos doing their bozo work.
Well, and we've seen all along that by the time the New York Times is ready to, confess something, you're like, oh, okay, now it's okay to say this, right? And I guess it's news maybe to the New York Times most ardent, followers. And I read the New York Times too, right? I think I read it as one of many sources, but I guess it's the New York Times talking to its farthest left people who just have no clue, right? And now that the New York Times has said it, now it's okay for the rest of us to say, and we don't have to worry about being kicked off Twitter for saying it. Right?
Exactly. It follows the same trajectory of everything, right? It follows the trajectory of lab leak, right? It follows the trajectory of, myocarditis. It follows the trajectory of, I predict the next ones are probably going to be ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. You know what I mean? Like these things that we were interested in, not necessarily advocated for or against, but wanted to talk about. And they suppressed speech. They suppressed opinions. Sure. And, but now, since, to your point, the New York Times is starting to suss this out, it's okay to talk about it. That's at once very frustrating. But obviously I'd rather it be talked about than not talked about. So yeah,
another signal of the beginning of the wind down of the pandemic response. I hope
so too. Mm-hmm. So just one more, a little bit of piece of business that came out is this response to the urgency of normal, which obviously some members of Team Reality, a lot of scientists, doctors, and experts launched the campaign Urgency of Normal a few weeks ago. I would say it had a pretty good reception. It made a pretty good splash. Obviously, one of the head doctors on there is Lucy McBride, and she is now a regular on CNN. And she plays the voice of reason, on CNN, which is great. And Lucy's awesome. And, Tracy Hoag's on there, a bunch of other people that we know and like and are very smart. And the Urgency of Normal, the original document, which I'm sure if, people watching know, if you don't, it's easily findable. It just urges an urgency to get back to normal. It talks about masks. It talks about pediatric vaccines. It's all about, getting kids back to school normally. And it is a very welcome, very well-reasoned deck. It's a slide deck. Mm-hmm. And of course, Team Crazy Pants, the COVIDians flipped out at this. They were, their reaction to Urgency of Normal was, it wasn't to argue the specific opinions or talk about the data or the evidence. It was to try and shut Advocacy of Normal down, and also to try and destroy and disparage the people involved in it. That's how they roll. I mean, they can't win the argument. So they try and destroy the people involved in the discussion. They try and silence dissent. They try and, come down on people. And it's really icky. It really bothers me that there are people out there that think that kind of behavior is okay or remotely helpful. So, fast forward a couple weeks, and last night they launched the urgency of equity, right? There's the E word. They obviously cribbed the structure, the urgency. They totally just stole it.
What's the hexagon for, by the way? Like, what is there?
There might be some.
Okay.
Who knows? Who knows?
A hex. I mean, hex in witchcraft has a certain meaning, but
yeah,
I didn't know if. All right, sorry, distraction there.
No worries. But we're not going to go too much into this. But I encourage everybody to check this out, read it. But I actually felt like a really, really, really good takedown of this was from our friend Keggs. And because a lot of people did it. A lot of people jumped right into this and were like, "This is complete BS." And let's go through it slide by slide and take it down. And I think that, that's what Keggs did here, Megan. And again, I'll put the link in the description, but if you go through this, she did a really great job of literally going slide by slide and, showing exactly how out of their tree these people are, because these are the slides that I honed in on immediately, which is, fact. Most evidence shows that there is minimal impacts of remote learning on children's mental health. This is something that I kind of had to grit my teeth about, because, you can certainly argue the level of impact. You can get into the minutia and talk about, specific cases and specific examples. But the problem I have here is this idea that this is a fact, right? That they put this out there with an assuredness that this stuff just doesn't exist, when any parent that has gone through this knows that it is absolutely more than minimal. My kids are good students. It's been horrible on them. Remote was absolutely it was destructive. And, specifically this slide and this next one, masks do not lead to learning loss. I mean,
well, here's go back. Here's the problem I have with this study. I need to read this one, but it says a CDC survey of parents revealed few differences between how parents saw their children's symptoms of depression, anxiety, psychological stress between different forms of schooling during the early pandemic.
Right. It's framing. It's how to lie with statistics.
The early pandemic. So are we talking about spring 2020? Because spring 2020, even though remote schooling, e-learning, whatever you want to call it, screen school was an unmitigated disaster. I would say in those early months of the pandemic response, there was, I don't want to say that people were positive, but there was like, okay, we're doing videos. We are, the entertainers are doing these musicals for us. We're all in this together. 2 weeks. Okay.
It was different.
Right.
Yeah.
It was very different. And we were being, in retrospect, you can see how we were kind of like strung along. Right. But there was a particular kind of buoyancy maybe at that time, and people were all at home, right? So you're with your family, and I don't mean to paint an idealistic picture of it.
No, but you're absolutely right.
It was a different vibe then.
It was absolutely, it was new. And even those of us that vehemently disagreed with the lockdowns, and I was advocating for our schools to open right back up on April 1st. Once we realized that the fix was in and they weren't going to listen, and they were, the crazy train had left the station and we were strapped onto it. Absolutely, most people tried to make the best of it. And, I don't know about you, but we immediately reduced our personal standards for our kids' educations, because, we were both working at the same time in the same house with the kids, trying to get them to do the schooling. And, after like the first few days even, and how difficult it was to have especially younger kids be self-motivated and have the self-discipline to be able to do this sort of remote school, which by the way was understandably to a large extent mishandled by the districts, right? Like I don't know about yours, but we magically got these Chromebooks and it just wasn't, it didn't work. Like they weren't prepared for this. And again, that's understandable, but they had these expectations that were way, way too high. And we just said, look, this is just going to be a lost, last 2 months of school for our kids. We're just going to have to deal with it. But again,
we're not even talking about it from the perspective of, can you imagine kids in single parent or guardian homes, that were left at home alone because the mother or father was an essential worker? My spouse went to work every day. He's in an executive position, but he's in a face-to-face, like live environment. He doesn't Zoom it in, right? And we're not disadvantaged. It's not what I'm saying, but many of the people he was overseeing, were hourly workers and people who had to leave their kids at home alone on
it was
computers. So to suggest that was not stressful for families or kids, it's outrageous.
It is outrageous, and to put it forth as a fact, that definitively. And again, we're not going to spend too much time on this, but it just keeps going. COVID-19 itself has had devastating impacts on experiences of death and dying on children. Look, I don't even know what that sentence means. And then here they quote in the purple box, they quote Tyler Black, which if anybody's on Twitter and knows who this guy is, he's a joke. Like it is.
Yeah. I wouldn't cite him.
Yeah. And you know what I mean? And
he's Canadian, is he not? Isn't he Canada?
I don't know.
That's why people shouldn't cite him, but yeah, he's
nothing against Canada, but yeah. And so, look, this is a very interesting thing, and it's one of those things that came out, and it didn't they came out and they had as much fanfare as they could, and it really didn't have that much traction. Like they were very low likes and very low retweets and comments until our friends started looking at this and just unloading on them. And these people haven't responded. Like they don't have a response. Their response is this. They said, A, we don't like the urgency of normal. We tried to cancel the people. It didn't work. They didn't want to go point by point and have a discussion about the urgency of normal points. So they came out with their own deck, a rip-off deck. And so they just pushed it out there and took their hands off. It's a very odd sort of credentialism. You know what I mean? Like if you scroll through it, and I'm not going to do the whole thing, but you'll see that they literally just screen grab the CDC site for mask efficacy. They screen grab the CDC's mask studies. And again, we've talked about this. We know about this. Every single one of their mask studies, and there are 13 or 14 that they have up there, is a joke. They have the hairdresser study, they have Maricopa, they have the Bangladeshi study, and they all have these absolutely inflated claims like masks prevent 70% of illness. And, if you know anything, if you've done any research outside of just blindly doing what you're told, that those figures are absolutely bonkers. Right. And so I don't even.
Yeah. And I think that the biggest problem with this whole effort is that they're branding it as like an equity effort, right? Like equity is what? Equity is remote schooling. Equity is forcing Black and brown kids to cover their faces in school and make them more afraid. I don't understand, but but equity, but racism are like two counterclaims that people on that side like to level to try to silence people, right? And I think people, I'm glad to know that not a lot of people were engaging positively with it, because I think it directly contradicts most people, at least most parents and kids' experiences, right? So at this point, after 2 years, it's like give it up. We're done. A lot of people obeyed and did what they were told, and we're done. So nice try.
Yeah, and it really does. It always seems to come back to evidence versus theory, right? And it's like, are you going to believe the science or your own lying eyes?
Right.
Right. You know,
Right.
like you
Right.
look at, like, it's just, you take Ian's and Clay's charts, you know, comparing, you know, this place with mask mandates and total lockdown, this place with not. And it's like every single time there's either no difference or the COVID place is almost worse. And it, you know, and again, they keep saying like, oh, but the mannequins, oh, but our charts, oh, but our models. And it's like, well, guys, you know, you shouldn't have done that to begin with, but now it's like we're in dozens and dozens of mistakes, massive, major mistakes that you have made.
Right. Right. The only way that the CDC honestly is going to be able to move on is if the people who are in power, including of course Rochelle Walensky, are resign and or are fired, or they're voluntold to resign. They just right then maybe there can begin to be some reform when new people come in, but that might not happen until the Biden administration has moved on as well. So maybe that's a little pie in the sky on my part.
Ugh.
But we'll see.
Well, we'll keep an eye on both of those things, especially, you know, obviously the equity thing is just kind of silly, unfortunately. But I wouldn't be surprised if some of our districts picked that up, like they picked up, you know, Benjamin's Duke ABC, you know, crapola and the AAP stuff. You know, I mean, it's in that realm, and we just have to be very
cheese model, the Swiss cheese model.
Yeah, the pea pants and all that stuff.
Right,
you know, just
right.
we really need to keep an eye on what our leaders, and especially like our local leaders, are using as reference. And the CDC thing is just an ongoing, you know,
irritation.
Well, so Michael Osterholm, this dude. So real quick, what was your opinion of him throughout the pandemic? Like, give me your take on.
Great question. Okay, so Osterholm, I do not put in the same box or category as like an Eric Ding, right? Or some of these complete panic pushers. Like, he does know some things about infectious diseases. He was a, you know, credentialed and respected person, you know, before all of this went down. So Osterholm is one of those people where, you know, sometimes he would just say some things that were completely disagreed with, but then other times there were glimmers of, oh, okay, like he gets it. I think it was in early fall or late summer where he did an interview on some podcast, and he was talking about viral interference, right, and about like, yeah, after the 2009 H1N1 virus, like we didn't see flu for a season or two. And so he's explaining like very, you know, expertly and like in plain terms, yes, you know, viral interference is a phenomenon that we've observed before. So then you're like, okay, you know, Osterholm. So that was before this podcast, or before the Joe Rogan experience, his interview with Rogan. I was, I mean, maybe ambivalent as best, right? At best. Like, sometimes he says good things, sometimes he says great things. But after listening to him on Joe Rogan, I'm like, okay, Osterholm is stuck in March 2020. And after, yes, I did listen to the show for 2.5 hours straight, because we were on our way back from Wisconsin. It was just my husband and I in the car. My husband had never heard Osterholm speak, and we were both like, we kept pausing and stopping and saying, what is this guy talking about? And the more he talked, the crazier he sounded.
Yep.
To me. What about you? What was your impression?
Well, throughout he was kind of one of the early experts out there.
He was on Rogan early on too. I haven't listened to that yet. I should.
He was. You know, it's funny. We probably should go, unless they deleted that one.
Sure, right.
Spotify's been deleting a bunch of them. But early on in the pandemic, I remember thinking exactly what your take was, where he was mostly not helpful, but there were like little bits of, you know, shimmering rays of light from him. Like he kind of, I don't know, I didn't know if it was a broken clock scenario or what, but you're absolutely right. There's a collection of experts who are, you know, profoundly unhelpful and, team apocalypse. And then there's like the Osterholms, and I don't want to throw too many people in that same basket, but, you know, sometimes helpful, sometimes not, right? And
Scott Gottlieb is like that as well.
I agree. I think Monica. I think
things,
Monica
but
Gandhi's in the same bucket. Frankly, she's super sweet. I
yeah.
like her. And again, I think I don't know if I'd get along with him personally, but I would like to be at a barbecue with Michael Osterholm and those guys. Whereas I probably would not want to accept the invitation to the barbecue with Eric Ding and Tyler Black. Actually, you know what? I would. I would
I would talk to anybody, right?
That's
I'll talk to
true.
anybody.
That's true.
But still,
I'll take that back.
Yeah.
But the thing that struck me, because you listened to it before I did, I listened to the, I've been listening to a bunch of, there's so much content out there these days, but you had listened to it before I did. And you're like, I really want to talk about this. And I was actually not going to listen to it because to me, it probably fell into the category of like, I know all this. I have a better use of 2 hours. Right. Like, and I kind of depend on our network to sort of, share clips or if he says something crazy. Sure. And the clip that most people shared, which we'll share part of as well, is where he talked about masks. And he once again, this is one of his bright spots, he declares cloth masks completely useless. He uses the term, fashion statements. But then he goes into, how N95s are super effective, but they have to be fitted well. And if you wear a beard, it makes no difference, blah, blah, blah. But that was the main clip I saw that was shared from him. But there was so much more in this 2.5 hours. And the thing that struck me right off the bat, and it set the tone, is when the show started. I actually don't have this clip, but when the show started, Rogan brings up the fact that he had Osterholm on before and he had scared the ever-loving shit out of everybody. Right. And they literally talk about it for a few minutes, how he had him on at the beginning of the pandemic and everybody was kind of, I wouldn't say blasé, but, kind of calm. And then Osterholm comes on and freaks everybody the hell out.
Right.
And it was just like, and then he keeps on it. He just consistently throughout this entire podcast. And again, this was the thread to me, is that he was an absolute Chicken Little Cassandra for 2.5 hours. It was just,
yeah. And I think he came on very much intending to just keep saying, I don't know. And he sort of meta at one point and says, like, doesn't he say something like, if you take anything away from this podcast, or, people are just going to be saying, well, Michael Osterholm.
Yes,
he
I have that clip. So,
and it's okay to say that you don't know, but the things that he was saying, I don't know about, it's like, no, those aren't things that you shouldn't not know about. Like, and to say I don't know at all at this stage, it was panicked.
Well, it was the entire episode.
And disingenuous. I think that's what it was. Some of the I don't knows I felt like were disingenuous.
He talked so much about being humble and admitting what you know and what you don't know, and he did say I don't know dozens of times throughout the interview, and made a point of saying it. Right. He made it very obvious that he was saying this on purpose. But then each and every time he went on and had an opinion about the thing he claimed that he didn't know about.
Right.
Which was, and I know you mentioned this, I don't want to steal your thunder, but you said to me right off the bat, you felt that Joe Rogan was kind of giving him rope to hang himself with, kind of not pushing on things that we would have pushed on necessarily, and just letting Michael Osterholm kind of talk his crazy talk and just, get it out there.
Yeah, I think it's more obvious too when you watch like video clips from it, because when I first heard it, we weren't watching it. We were listening to it in the car. But then if I go back and I watch Rogan, I can see a little more strategy. There's still some things I think he should have pushed on or asked. But yeah, there is a benefit to just letting this guy go and letting him talk and not maybe confronting him, especially when it's somebody maybe who's as prominent as Osterholm is, just maybe let him talk and then let social media go after him, or let the record stand, right? Let the record, like the transcript is there, like he is on the record. So I don't want to be too harsh about Rogan, even though there's some things I think he should have pushed back on, but.
Yeah. And again, this was a huge section at the beginning of the interview where they were talking about the lab leak. And it was this weird thing where Rogan kept pushing it. He asked probably a dozen plus questions about gain of function, lab leak, all this stuff. And Osterholm would answer each one of them by saying, I don't know, this is out of my expertise, even though it kind of is in his expertise, which I think is why Joe Rogan kept asking about it. But then Osterholm would continue to answer the question. And a lot of times he would answer it kind of in a weird roundabout way. And Rogan honestly kind of kept asking the same questions or very similar questions over and over again. So I think that there was a strategy there. I didn't learn anything new. All I learned was that the main takeaway from that section was that Osterholm, his opinion on this is to not look into it. He does not want to look into the lab leak. He thinks it's moot, to use our favorite new word.
That's a good word,
yeah. But and this is something that I don't personally understand, because I think that it's water under the bridge, but if you want to fix this, keep it from happening again, look into our scientific system to make sure that it's not being like why would you not want to look into this? It makes no sense to me.
Right. Well, that's where I thought Rogan should have said, okay, what are some questions that you have, Dr. Osterholm, about the origins of COVID? What do you think we need to know? At one point, I actually wrote it down in my notebook because I was taking notes during the original listen of the podcast, but Osterholm says, well, I don't know, but I know there's no evidence of that. And he was talking about the lab leak, or it coming from, or I think being like created by man-made. And it's so funny. It's like, you don't know, but there's no evidence. I mean, it was just really funny. But then he also, I'm with you. It's like he doesn't want to look into it, or it's and it is very complicated. I admit myself. I mean, I have some theories or thoughts when I read, different people's takes on it, but like the people who are really, really good, what's her name? Alina Chan. Is that her name? Do you know what I'm talking about?
So. Yep.
Like, she is so knowledgeable, and she knows so much about just that whole world of virology research and what happens at these labs, that I get it. Like, I don't choose to spend my time on the technical aspects of that. So I don't think there's anything wrong with Osterholm saying that, but he almost pretended like he wasn't even interested, or worse, that whether it's leaked from a lab, man-made, gotten from bats, and then man, intervened or whatever, like, that doesn't matter. I think that's what bothered me.
It bothered me too.
This is just a fun thing, or these sets of questions. I'll let other people deal with that, but I don't know, and it doesn't really matter. It has no implications, and it doesn't raise questions about what we did in response to that. Do you know what I'm saying?
Totally.
So he used I don't know in so many different ways, almost as like a euphemism throughout the podcast. It'd be interesting to go back and be like, okay, when he says I don't know here, what does he really mean?
And it literally was one of those things. I listened to it once with my jaw on the floor, and then I actually kind of had to go back and listen to it again. And one of the things that if I had all the time in the world, I would have done was a supercut of him saying, I don't know. Because again, he said it dozens and dozens of times. It was like, I don't know, but I don't know, but I don't know, but it's out of my expertise, but yeah. All the while pushing the fear, pushing the panic.
Yes.
And so let me play this first clip here. This is not super in order, but this is a really good one of him honestly pushing the fear porn.
With this disease? Well, I think, Joe, that's one of those questions, again, that kind of begs the very issue of what is this SARS-CoV-2 virus all about? Because if you go from the beginning of the COVID pandemic to now, look at how different the ancestral variant illness was to Alpha, to Delta, to Omicron, just in a matter of 2 years.
Right.
I mean, it's amazing how much, and the question you asked me earlier about the issue with Omicron, why do we see so many infections out there? Because it's much more infectious. And I think that what we're watching here is a really real-time evolution of a virus that, we could never, suggest for a moment that the measles virus is going to change a whole lot in 2 years. It hasn't changed basically in decades and decades and decades. So I think this is one of the challenges we have and when I answered your question earlier about what is the future of this pandemic, it's because this virus keeps throwing 210-mile-an-hour curveballs at us. I don't know what the future is going to bring yet. Maybe one of these variants is going to spin out of this that is going to, again, cause a large number of cases, some of it severe, and is going to evade the immune protection that we have already.
How is that helpful?
It's not at all.
What is this guy doing?
He was so panicked about Omicron? Like, does he not realize that we all know people that have had COVID, and that a lot of people that we know who had COVID had it in this last wave and were vaccinated? Do you know what I mean? Like, does he not understand that people's, I hate this term, but lived experience, that's redundant. So just that their experience
Sure.
like contradicts what he's saying.
Well, it goes back to your own lion eyes. It's like, what are you seeing? And nobody thinks that their exact perspective or their personal perspective absolutely, translates
Sure.
out to the, like that's not
Right.
what we're saying here. But you're absolutely right. And he goes into that. And this clip might be that clip. I couldn't get all the fear porn clips. There were just too many where he was just, being Chicken Little and just like, oh my God, this is, so dangerous and so scary. But his point about Omicron is that, yes, it's milder, but it's more transmissible. So it's exponential. It's like, dude, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Ugh, let's watch
hear
this
it.
one. Let's see if this one's it.
Is, Joe, that we've lost so many senior doctors and nurses who are just burnt out. That even though we
this
have
is
the pipeline
hospitals.
coming in from medical school, we've had more applications in medical school in the last year than we've had in many years. But the problem is it takes time to educate them, to get them to be in a more senior status, learned status. And so for this period of time right now, we're going to have real troubles if we have another big surge, because it was almost like a vicious cycle. The more people that were infected meant more cases in the hospitals, the more care needed. The more care needed, the more people were stretched. The more people got stretched working, the more quit. The more that quit meant that the fewer people had that much more work to do again and again. And that's
Cascading
why
effect.
And I thought I'd never see this in my lifetime, but all 8 of the major healthcare systems in the state of Minnesota, including the Mayo Clinic, took a full-page ad out in papers around Minnesota back during the Omicron surge, begging people, please don't get infected. We can't take care of you. We don't have, the quality of care has dropped. When you were during this recent Omicron surge, you did not want to have a heart attack. You did not want to have an automobile accident or a stroke because of the challenge. We saw people literally waiting 2 days in emergency rooms.
Really?
Oh, it's crazy. And it was just a shortage of staff. So equipment wasn't the problem. Beds weren't the problem. It's people. And so I think that that's one of the things we have to really invest in right now if we're going to be prepared for any future surge. And what we have to understand is how many healthcare workers now, not just the stress of what they did, but how many times that they're vilified in the community because people say, you didn't do what you should have done to save my loved one's life, etc. And they're doing everything they can.
Okay, I'm sorry. He is completely making up. Well, there's a lot of made up stuff in there, but
Yep.
that a lot of times healthcare workers are vilified in their community. I mean,
who does that?
He's made that's a complete
Lie.
fabrication. It's
Absolutely.
a complete fabrication. And I understand, like Joe Rogan on his show, he doesn't try to be hostile with people,
Right.
which is good, right? He doesn't like, reach over the table and, and the guy could, right? Like MMA fighter, but he doesn't, right? So he's actually very self-controlled in that setting. But how in the world can Osterholm say something like that? What's funny about it is earlier in the podcast, he decries the use of anecdotes, saying, anecdotes aren't data, which is true.
Yep.
I agree with him. But then he inserts throughout the whole show, he inserts these little, like straw men that,
Yep.
and these fabrications, like that doesn't ring true with anyone. That's absolutely not true.
Yeah. Yeah. And the fact that these hospitals took out full-page ads to also scare the ever-loving shit out of everybody is not a data point. It's not a proof point, right? That does not mean, and there's another clip I have that kind of dovetails to this about, the hospital staff. And this was something that I need to dig a little bit more on, because he talks about the fact that not a lot of hospital staff have been fired for not taking the vaccine, which is weird because, in New York, we have, tens of thousands of them who were fired, everybody from registered nurses to doctors. And again, it's like, it adds up to about 30% of the hospitals. And, they had to use the freaking National Guard to fill them in. And Osterholm claims that it's only like less than 1%.
Well, and maybe fired, no, but people who were presented with a job or jab, choice, and they resigned or left, right? So I don't know if he's using a rhetorical, I don't know, he's exit there by saying, well, we didn't have that many people that were fired, right? Because of it.
Yeah. But this idea that, yes, they're stressed, but for somebody like this who works in medicine-ish, right? Like, for him to know less about how hospitals function than us
Right.
is a little weird. You know, is he naive? Is he stupid? Is he sort of dumb stupid? You know, stupid dumb or smart dumb? You know, I know some people who are like really, really, really book smart, but you know, can't, you know, make an omelet, right? Like, is he like that
Sure.
kind of dude?
Sure.
Because
well, he mentions Minnesota. Did you hear the part where he mentions Minnesota and says we've had the worst 12 weeks that we've had of the past 12 weeks have been the worst that we've had the entire pandemic. I looked up on the Rational Ground, you know, dashboard, the hospital capacity dashboard for the state of Minnesota. I mean, they might have had some localized hospitals that got busy. We get that in Chicago every respiratory virus season, but I'm like, what is he talking about? Like, these averages are fine.
Exactly. And we went over a few episodes ago, we talked about, you know, the influenza epidemic of 2019 or 2016. And, you know, people were in tents and, you know, parking lots, and it was hospitals were overflowing. But like again, it's not because it's so much viral illness. It's a lot, you know, nobody's saying that this isn't a bump, you know, people getting sick, going to hospital. Obviously they're going to the hospital, not always because they need to go to the hospital. A lot of this is because, you know, those stupid newspaper ads freak the shit out of everybody. And they're like, oh my God, I think I have the Crohn's, you know, and they go into the hospital where we know that there's a lot of spread of this stuff in the hospitals. Like, thanks, it's been happening for 2 years. But it's interesting because the fact that we were trying to flatten the curve, right? Flatten the curve always meant keeping our hospitals from looking like Italy's. That was it. Obviously, there was mission creep. You know, everybody turned that into like something that it wasn't, but that was the original thought. And it's ironic almost that because of what they've done to our medical establishment, both from sort of a private equity standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint, and also from, you know, the mandate standpoint, they have, you know, any overwhelming of the hospitals right now, especially with Omicron, is kind of a self-inflicted wound by these morons.
Right. And I haven't heard anybody actually define what overwhelmed means. I mean, you know, busy, right? Like a restaurant or hotel is overwhelmed. Like what would that even mean? I guess a ratio of staff to need that they couldn't meet. I guess that's what that would mean. But
or tents in the parking lot like they did in 2016, which they haven't done for this in a lot of places. They didn't even use the tents in New York. So
well, and I think the other thing that he's assuming, my husband quipped about Osterholm. He's like, that guy can sit in a room by himself and panic if he wants to, but like keep him away from policy making of any kind,
people
right?
listen
Like
to
we don't need somebody like that influencing or making policy. But what and he's not the only one, but he and others, including the mainstream media, have done is they've created this sense of ethical or moral obligation among we the people, that we have to order our lives around hospital stress and capacity. And really, that is taking what we have always assumed, what is sort of our contract, if you will, with our government about kind of how our society runs, and turning it around. And it's just it's unprecedented as far as I know, especially for this duration, for 2 years, to say, you know, your kid has to wear a mask because we don't want the nurse to be overwhelmed. I mean, that just, it doesn't jive with anything that we've ever assumed in this country, ever.
It's completely flopped. It's like this bank shot responsibility game that they play. You know, I call it 6 degrees of COVID bacon. And it's like, you know, everything from sort of the silent super spreader to the overwhelmed hospitals. It's this flopping of responsibility, from personal responsibility to this weird sort of communal responsibility, which they insist it rests on the shoulders of individuals, right? And it's such a contradiction of, you know, philosophical you know, focus, right? Because it just the selfishness of these laptop idiots who are just scared and insisting that everybody else kowtow to their hysteria has been almost the sole driver of this. You know, everything else sort of emanates from that. Well, let me play this next one on the it's
Great.
just on this theme, the hospitals.
Yeah,
they keep going. It gets better.
Because of our having gone through this pandemic, that we are better prepared for another pandemic. Like, say if COVID was to die off, you don't think so?
We're in much worse shape.
Why is that?
500,000 healthcare workers have quit their jobs in the last 2 years. I have seen battle-fatigued soldiers who are friends of mine come back from war with less post-traumatic stress syndrome than you see in the healthcare workers. We don't really have a good sense of just how fragile our healthcare system is right now.
If that's the case, why would they fire so many unvaccinated workers?
Well, they didn't fire so many. There was 1% to 2% at most. 1%. Mayo Clinic.
That's really
Mayo Clinic fired 700 people out of 700 people out of 77,000. Okay, and again, you have to look at where their jobs were. Were they in intensive care or not? Were they up front? Were they the people that were admitting, etc.
So you think that's a false narrative? That
I think it's absolutely a false narrative. Absolutely.
Unvaccinated healthcare workers.
Very few of the doctors and nurses who work in intensive care were unvaccinated. They want to be vaccinated to protect themselves. I mean, we've lost 3,000 healthcare workers have died of COVID since the beginning of the pandemic. And so they want to be vaccinated largely. And as I said, 99% of doctors got vaccinated quickly. I think the challenge is we don't understand yet is how fragile our healthcare system is. So when you ask me, are we better prepared right now? The Department of Labor has just surveyed healthcare workers and think that we're going to see a number of them quitting in the next 3 to 6 months, just they're burnt out.
What?
Let me just do a fact check there for a second. He said 300,000 healthcare workers have died since the beginning of the pandemic. Have died of what? Have died of what? We don't have 300,000 healthcare worker COVID deaths in.
No,
I think
he said 3,000.
Oh, I thought he said 300,000.
No, he was talking.
Okay,
he was kind of riffing around. Yeah,
okay, my bad. Okay.
But again, is that with or from? Right.
I don't know how many healthcare workers die a year of all causes. I mean, I'm not saying that's no big deal, right? But again, it's back to that failure to contextualize data, right? Which the CDC is largely culpable of, but so are people like Osterholm, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my God. There was so much wrong with that. It's just infuriating that he would say a lot of that stuff because, again, this idea that the hospital capacity has been overwhelmed has been this ongoing theme that has been recycled to drive this unfounded fear. Mm-hmm. It is so profoundly unhelpful, and it almost becomes this self-perpetuating prophecy because we have these so super quick personal story early on, and I'm talking March here in New York, right? Because it hit New York, and New York was like and we were all, even though I was like, I didn't like the lockdowns. I was very skeptical of all this stuff. I was just, I was firmly on team reality, but, still kind of looking at stuff. It was concerning here in New York because everybody was freaked the fuck out. Mm-hmm. And, Trump, sailed the Mercy ship up here, and they built, camps and the Javits Center. They did a field hospital in Central Park. They built a $12 million COVID only hospital in Brooklyn. And we were all just kind of waiting. Right. But what happened is all of these healthcare workers started doing social media. They started doing these little fear porn hits on TikTok and Instagram, and it started getting picked up. And it became this performative theater. And I'm not saying that there wasn't a lot of death and misery, and it was definitely a spike. There were a lot of sick people. There were a lot of sirens going around in the city at the time. But and it was interesting because there was a very famous couple of pieces from nurses who, because they shipped in nurses and care personnel from other places, and there were a lot of these nurses that came from other hospitals into specifically the city hospitals in New York, which are notoriously horribly run. Like the New York City hospitals are bad. If you're in New York City and something happens to you, you do not want to get taken to a city hospital. Mm-hmm. Okay. That's where the homeless people go. No offense to the homeless people. But these people that were shipped in were doing videos like, it was this one woman, I think she was from North Carolina. She was like, I've worked in, ER wards all my life and ICUs, and I've never seen such incompetence in my life. Like the people in charge here are killing people. And so it was very interesting because a younger kid I know who's a doctor worked in a hospital, and he actually went on Rachel Maddow and claimed that there were bodies lining the hallways and, mass death. And he was like, it's a war zone. And he was, had a little tear going on. And I'm looking at this going, what? Is this true? I just happen to know the administrator of that hospital. So I picked up the phone and I called him and I said, hey man, sorry about your hospital. It seems like a war zone there. You know what he said? He goes, what are you talking about? I said, we're fine. We got like, I don't know, 8 people in the ICU. They're all fine. Yeah, it sucks. It's a pretty good, respiratory illness wave, but we've seen these before. We're fine. The guy lied. He went on national television and lied. He was doing what Osterholm is doing here.
Yeah. I think people, and I've tried to show this with Chicago's data, with Illinois' data, with national data. I know Phil Kerpen has done this a lot too. So is Stinson Norwood on Twitter. Yep. But the truth is, maybe there were some isolated incidents, maybe in parts of New York City, like you said, just due to sheer incompetence and panic, if nothing else. But the truth is that the hospitals were fairly empty in spring 2020. I can say for a fact that in Illinois and Chicago, that the people that were being sent there were largely people who were already in managed care. That's long-term care facility patients. But we had a 40% drop in emergency department visits in Chicago hospitals that we still haven't come back to pre-March 2020 levels. And the other, we should do a whole episode on this, but the other thing that people are maybe kind of starting to talk about, but is that we've had a huge increase in deaths at home, and that people did go to the hospital. There's evidence that if people had symptoms of COVID, that were being blasted at them, through the TV, et cetera, that they would go to the hospital for that. But visits for, heart related, like heart pain, right? Like went way down.
Absolutely.
And deaths at home went way up. And so that, the hospitals not being full is a bad thing, not a good thing, right? And so I hate when Osterholm is pushing this, because the more he pushes about panic at the hospitals, we know that people will stay away from the hospitals out of fear, unless they think it's COVID.
Right. Well, and that was the point of him citing those 2 full-page ads from the hospitals, right? Saying, oh my God, this is so amazing. We can't do, this is so horrible. We're being overrun. And if you have, I remember seeing these, right? The crux of it was, we're not doing enough to combat COVID. And so we are overrun. And again, we've talked about why that is. And therefore, if you have a heart attack or, some other illness, we can't help you.
Sure.
Right. And there's so much to unpack there. But my first question when I heard him say that was, where did all the money go?
Sure.
We spent trillions of dollars that our grandkids don't even have to supposedly fund this. Mm-hmm. And these hospitals are having to take out full-page ads to say, we're screwed, you're screwed, everybody's screwed. It doesn't make one lick of sense to me.
No, remember the ventilators, right? I mean, you look at Illinois ventilator use from the beginning of the pandemic till now, and we had an influx, you see it go up with all these ventilators that we received, but we never used even a fraction of them statewide. Same is true in Chicago. So yeah, I mean, I suppose more ventilators is a good thing to have on hand. But do you remember the panic around that?
But I think that we learned, well, the ventilators are, I mean, personally for me, one of the few things that I kind of forgive, right? Because it was like, it was coming so quick. It was only coming quick because everybody was paying attention to Ukraine, and then, suddenly shifted in early February or mid-February. But the ventilators were because of Italy, right? Because, they had their hospitals. They did have their hospitals overrun, which, by the way, their socialist hospitals suck. They just suck. And their hospital system was just exposed for sucking. But they knew it was a respiratory illness. They claimed that part of the reason why they had such, misery was because of the lack of ventilators. And so therefore, ergo, we sort of, Trump did this, and he tried to, I think he even ended up forcing by executive decree GM, to change. And I did not agree with that. I did not like that at all. But to make ventilators. And, it turned out pretty quickly that we learned, by the end of April, I think, that we learned that the ventilators were actually killing people. It was pushing, like the ventilators were pushing the mucus and stuff into the airways and the parts of the lungs that, you know what I mean? It was sort of like, and they were like, oh, we should just put people on their stomachs, which they discovered in Mexico. They were like, that's much better. So.
Yeah, that just, a debacle. I agree. I can forgive getting the ventilators, but it was all part of the panic that I think ultimately pushed people away from the hospital for everything else but COVID.
It is, and the irony there is they freaked everybody out so much that people that thought that they might have COVID rushed into the hospital, right? And the hospitals became spreader places. Again, these idiots did this with their panic.
Right. You know, that's another data point that either HHS or CDC, they have this data. Now, HHS does publish nosocomial infection data for hospitals, but it's people who are they only report people who are in the hospital, who've been in the hospital for 14 days or longer, and then test positive for COVID.
Right.
But I think nosocomial infections, and I'm not even saying lethal nosocomial infections, right? Like somebody goes into the hospital for something else, contracts COVID, and then dies of COVID, legit. Like I'm not saying that there's a ton of that, but it's interesting because the hospitals are, as we know, incentivized for COVID patients, for COVID positive patients. Yeah. We know that people get $9,000 or can get $9,000 from the federal government if their loved one's death certificate says COVID somewhere.
The best of intentions behind these policies.
I mean, I don't think it's any coincidence that most of our COVID deaths are at the hospital, right? That our number of COVID deaths that occur at home, and I even have a lot of questions about that, but that's for another episode sometime. But, you know, if this were really as deadly as some people would want us to believe, our at-home COVID deaths would probably be pretty high, right? Not just at the hospital. So that's kind of food for thought. I want to bring up an Osterholm clip. I don't have mine loaded. Okay, I'm gonna try to do this and hope that it works. Can I just screen share? Sorry, people who are watching, we're watching my technical. Can I just screen share it?
Sure.
Okay, let me try that. So
this is permission to screen share.
I know, but I hope this works. So this is Osterholm talking about Omicron and children, and he makes some pretty bold claims here. So let me try to cue this.
Oh, goody.
I actually could not believe it when I heard him say what he says. So let's see, just entire screen, right? Entire screen. Should I do that? Here. Let's see. All right.
I can hear it through your computer. Not seeing it though. It's not playing it.
Oh, it's not playing at all?
No.
Okay, let me just say what he said there. He said that 1,334 kids have died in the Omicron wave of COVID.
Yeah.
What's so crazy about that, even if you just go to the CDC's provisional counts, kids defined as age 0 to 17, we have all deaths involving COVID throughout the whole pandemic. They're showing 822 for the whole pandemic.
Right.
So I don't know.
I heard that too.
I don't know what Osterholm is, I mean, he's clearly reading something there, and he goes on to talk about how Omicron has been more deadly for kids than Delta. I mean, he's just, I need to call him out on Twitter more explicitly for this, but I don't know. I don't know where he's getting that number and how he can say honestly that COVID is really deadly for kids at all. And that doesn't mean that some kids haven't died, but I don't know where he's getting these stats from and why he can just make things up.
He did that. He did that several times in this interview. And one of the clips I'll play in a bit is at the end. they actually called him out on his Israel claims, which was very interesting. But actually, you know what? I can play that now. Let me do that.
Yeah.
So essentially what had happened, and I'm just going to play the end of it. He claimed that the unvaccinated in Israel were the vast majority of cases, since the late summer, early fall. And Joe Rogan, naturally was like, I think I've seen like a ton of articles and, statistics and things to show that's not the case. They're, one of the most vaccinated, places on the face of the earth. And Osterholm, stood his ground and said, no, it's the unvaccinated who are driving this. And so at the end of the show, they had Osterholm's aide and I think, Joe Rogan's staff, brought up and they sort of looked at it. And I thought this was very interesting because they call Osterholm out. Right. And he has to admit that it's just not what he said it was. So check it out.
So to wrap it up, what's your assessment of what we just looked at in terms of like the Israeli data?
I think the really important message here, if you look at the countries, what happens to them in terms of cases, severe illnesses, hospitalizations, deaths, it's vaccine, vaccine, vaccine. Good example.
But is it true? Is 90% of the population of Israel have at least 2 doses of the vaccine?
Yes, the data we have shows that. But the
right,
point
but
of it
that
is,
was what we
no, but
talked
I'm talking
earlier.
about the fact if you look at the surge, it's being contributed by those people who are unvaccinated,
completely unvaccinated, or
unvaccinated,
2 shots?
and well, we have a number of them that have 1 shot, which is not nearly enough adequate protection.
Unless it's the J&J.
No, that's even people who have gotten mRNA but just got 1 shot. We still see that here in the United States.
Right, but I'm saying, is the J&J count as like a 1 shot? Because 1 shot is fully vaccinated with the J&J until you get a second one.
I don't know in Israel how much J&J was used. I don't know.
So your thought is the reason why everything's going sideways in Israel is not the failing of the protection of the vaccine, but rather the fact that there is a substantial portion of the population that's unvaccinated?
It's both. But what I'm saying is what really brought that surge on was in terms of hospitalizations, severe illness, and deaths was largely, that surge piece was among unvaccinated or one with 1 dose.
Okay, so it's 1 dose or 0 doses.
Yes.
It's not 2 doses.
It's not 2 doses, right.
So when you hear about vaccinated people catching COVID in Israel, it's a small percentage?
Small percentage of what?
Of their population that has COVID?
No, actually, I shouldn't say small. Yeah, it is relative. But if you look at the total numbers, we also did see infections among people who were fully vaccinated.
Yes.
What we're talking about, and I talk about that surge, I'm talking about it in terms of severe illness, hospitalizations, and deaths. And that was being driven largely by those who were unvaccinated or who had just a single dose. And that's what those data show.
I don't even know how to respond to that because he had claimed earlier in the show that, 98% of the cases were caused by the unvaccinated. So they came back and they shared this, which, they compared data, I guess, behind the scenes. They came back and you can see as he sort of tries to equivocate his way out of this, right? And it's like, well, they're not unvaccinated. They have less than the full course and it's less than 4, less than 3. They can't figure out if it's 2 or 1. But calling people that have a dose or 2 doses unvaccinated and using that to explain away the fact that the most, the country on earth that has the most people with the most shots is having the biggest spike, right? It's like,
yeah,
the pretzels that this guy, ties himself into here are pretty legendary.
Well, and he also earlier in the podcast, he does say that he thinks fully vaccinated should be 3 doses for the Moderna and the Pfizer and 2 doses for J&J. He says that at some point.
He does. I actually have that clip. He talks about he doesn't like the term booster. He thinks that that's unhelpful.
Yeah. So I don't know if he's just applying his own definition there.
But that's not his job.
No,
you can't make somebody like Osterholm cannot make a claim like he made, which is, the spike in Israel is caused by and among the unvaccinated. And then when you look at the data in terms of the population, the percent of the population that is vaccinated, of course, you can break that down into sort of 4, 3, 2, 1. But, they Osterholm and others play this game where they get to pick and choose what the definition of unvaccinated means, right? And it always seems to cut in the favor of them blaming it on people that don't exist.
Right.
you know?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, kudos to Rogan for keeping him honest on that, because he did. I mean, they talked about it in the middle of the podcast, and then didn't they have a researcher, or Osterholm had his researcher waiting outside the door or something like that. So then Joe comes back to it. So I'm glad, but I don't know that Osterholm got any clarity, or like, does he just, and even earlier in the podcast, like he talks about COVID hospitalizations and kids being hospitalized, and he just seems completely unaware of the fact that, people who are in the hospital, we know this. I mean, we've known this all along, right? But now there's more admission of this, that, people, a COVID hospitalization is somebody who's in the hospital and has tested positive for COVID, either upon admission or at some point during their stay. It's not somebody who's necessarily hospitalized, in order to get treatment for COVID. Right. So, I mean, how does Osterholm not know this?
He does. Yeah. And like everybody, he uses these things, and he uses, again, the most fearful definition, or the most fearful perspective that you can have looking at each one of these things, he embraces. Yeah. And it seems to come from this noble lie territory of, the more scared we can make people, the more likely they'll be to comply. And sadly, that strategy seems to work for them. Mm-hmm. Right. And to me, that's where that comes from.
I agree. I think the most, and I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with the clips that I clipped here, but I think toward the end, you may have this, and you feel free to pull it up if you do, but toward the end of the podcast, he's talking about mandates and lockdowns. I wish Rogan would have pushed him a little bit more on this, but Osterholm basically does not disavow lockdowns or even mandates, or even mask mandates if it's N95s. Like he does not. He doesn't even seem willing to, and I think this is what set my husband off so much. Like, he doesn't even seem to be willing to acknowledge the price that so many people have paid from these.
He thinks it's worth it. He thinks it's worth it.
And he's sitting in his little infectious disease basement. Wasn't this trip to Rogan only his second time on a plane? He said during this, since March 2020. So this guy is fearful to some extent, and then he's just acting like, hey, well, I mean, what, lockdowns didn't affect him, because he has a weekly podcast himself, right?
Oh yeah, he's doing just fine.
All kinds of stuff. So like, and Osterholm's not the only one who's guilty of this, right? It's like, oh, the pandemic has worked out really well for me. So what do you mean that this is really
the lack of empathy? The lack of empathy. It's absolutely astounding. And I say this a lot, and not to get too political, but there are so many self-proclaimed progressive people that, claim to care about these things. They claim to care about the less fortunate. They claim to care about third world countries and the environment. And these are the people that are, advocating for this absolute destruction of the very groups and causes that they claim to care so much about. The selfishness and the hypocrisy from the Team Apocalypse is absolutely astounding.
And he does say, I mean, and when he's talking about that, potentially an N95 or high grade mask mandate or lockdowns, he said, he says when transmission is high for a limited time period.
Right.
Oh, really? Limited? Like you mean 2 weeks? Is that what you mean? Or 2 weeks and then all of a sudden it's 2 years?
Yeah.
So again, he can have his opinions, right? But just keep this guy away from any kind of policy influence, because we're done. We're done with that. And if you're not disavowing lockdowns, or if you're not able to admit the harms that they cause at this point, I'm sorry, I'm not really.
Or at least that there's a trade-off.
Right. And he doesn't even seem willing to acknowledge that.
No. Well, here's the clip that you were referring to. And I think that we're going to see that, he tries to clarify his overall stance. And then he gets into what you just said, which is he seems to be in favor of, bringing all this stuff back.
Right. Right. If we need, because we just don't know.
So what should you be doing? You think?
Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. I clicked it too quick.
No, I was just saying.
So what should you be doing? You think everybody should be not eating on a plane and just keep up
I think phase? Well, first of all, I wrote a piece, again, not long after I was on here, where I didn't support general lockdowns. I said, you know what? When you have a surge, apply the brakes. And what you're applying the brakes for is trying to keep people from overwhelming the healthcare system. And of course, you want people not to become seriously ill and die. But that if you maintain lockdowns, as they call them, when you don't have high activity, and we had many parts of Minnesota that didn't know of anybody that got infected in greater Minnesota, and yet they went into that. that's a challenge. But when you do see the transmission, then you want to have that limited time period. Well, I'm the same way with mask mandates. Two things. One, there's a time and a place if you want to try to stop or eliminate transmission as much as you can. But then also don't make a mandate around somebody wearing a face cloth covering.
Because it doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
Yeah.
Make a mandate for, I mean, and then he goes on to talk about N95s or high quality masks and how, mandates with those for a limited time period, he'd be in favor of those. I mean, what?
Well, but then he talks about how, and let me just on the heels of that, let me play this one. We'll just watch his mask. You're exactly right. Like he talks about how masks don't work, about how normal people cannot be trusted to wear N95s, but also that we should have them in our toolbox in case there's a spike and they don't work, but we should use them and localize lockdowns to keep our hospitals from being overwhelmed without even thinking about why our hospitals, don't have the capacity to handle this stuff. Oh, good Lord. Where's this guy? Here he is.
It's work. I'll answer that if you can tell me what.
Hold on. The beginning of this is pretty important.
Do you think masks work?
I'll answer that if you can tell me what's similar between a 747 and a car.
What's similar?
Yeah.
They both hold people.
They both have tires. That's it. Well, masks are like tires. They're different. They're totally different. And so whether you have the N95 on, that thing that I wore into the studio, which is a high level of protection, or you wear a face cloth covering, totally different between night and day how well they work. Shortly when I was on here in 2020, I wrote a piece in April 2020 saying this is aerosol transmitted. It's like a perfume. It's like smoke. And basically you have to have high level respiratory protection to really protect yourself. And what we did is we got into people saying, well, anything works. And some studies were done, which frankly, if one of my graduate students had done those studies, I would have failed them. Because they were so badly done in terms of trying to understand did face cloth coverings work. Well, they don't. They're much more of a clothing decoration than they are anything about really working. And so when you ask me, do N95s and KN95s work? I'd say yes. If I say a face cloth covering, surgical mask, no. And that's a big problem.
A lot of people are wearing those surgical masks, which are to stop droplets when you're doing surgery, right?
Yeah, and not only that, but just on my trip down here, which this is only my second trip in 2 years. Some of you fly 150,000 air miles a year. I can't tell you how many people were not wearing masks at all, even though it was mandated, or they wore them on their chin. They were chin diapers. Yeah. That was it. We've been doing a study where we freeze frame news media reports and just look at the people in the frame, whether indoors or outdoors. We have consistently seen since the beginning of the pandemic, a quarter of the people wear it under their nose. That's like fixing 3 of the 5 screen doors in your submarine. It doesn't matter. What good does it do?
Okay, so here's what he's doing. Let's capture what he's doing. He's saying cloth masks don't work, and then he's also saying like the reason that masks in general really haven't prevented 200 million people plus in the United States from contracting COVID is because people aren't wearing them right. Do you see what I'm saying? Like they'll never give this up. Why?
But it defies basic logic. And what it shows me is that a lot of these people like Osterholm, a lot of others, really have no basic understanding of human nature. Right. And they just don't, it's a very selfish kind of behavior. It's very narcissistic because so if you believe what he believes, right, which is, cloth masks and surgical masks have no effect, but N95s do. His solution to this is to, when there's a surge, I guess he's not, for it 24/7, thank God. But when there's a surge, we got to lock people down and then what? Force them to properly wear an N95? You know what I mean? Like he talks about how it doesn't work with people with beards or even for kids. And he still has this in his toolbox. So the problem is he actually hasn't thought this through either.
No. Right. Which is, again, why he should be very, very far away from any influence on policy, and I think Scott Atlas has said that too, not directly about Osterholm, but, Scott Atlas is a public health policy expert. I think Jay Bhattacharya is too, correct?
Yes,
I know Atlas is.
That's exactly what he does.
These people are people who understand, not just things about a virus or things about spread, but they see the bigger picture, right?
Yes.
Like, okay, there might be these pie in the sky things that, an academic or a virologist wants to do, but they're not humane.
But they also don't take into account the other parts of our society, which, from the very beginning, that was one of the ones that really rubbed me the wrong way, which is like, you're killing my grandma for your economy, and it's like,
That's not.
what are you
That's
even
not
talking about?
right.
Like,
Right.
you know,
It's unfair. It's an unfair.
well,
It's a false dilemma.
it's ironically selfish as shit.
Yeah.
You know what I
right.
mean? Like
Exactly.
for you to pretend like the economy doesn't matter is naive. And then all of a sudden you find yourself in this position where they're like, well, it shouldn't matter. And I found out, unfortunately, a lot of my friends and acquaintances are closet socialists because they're like, well, this is probably for the best. We need a complete rehaul of how we do. It's like, what are you talking
Well,
about?
again, those are people that this whole thing has worked out well for them.
They're
right?
all, yeah, every
Right.
single one of them. And
Right.
all of them were fairly well off, to begin with.
Sure.
Oh my God.
So, all right.
Here,
Anything else you got for Osterholm?
I got a couple more.
Okay,
These are
couple more.
pretty quicks.
Let's see it.
This is very
Countries, do
interesting.
you think that were a model of how to handle the pandemic correctly?
I think trying to make the very best out of a horrible situation, I think Australia and New Zealand have probably done as well as any two countries. And you can say,
Can you believe that shit?
No. No, I can't. No, I can't. I mean,
Yeah.
what is his definition of what? Again, he's looking myopically at one thing, right? Like the number of deaths in these island countries.
Right. They have completely decimated, any idea of, freedom of movement, speech, association. Yeah.
Water under the bridge, right?
Water under the bridge.
Right.
Oh man. Hold on, one more. This is a good one. He talks about long COVID here. And this is a little bit of a longer one, but I think because we've talked about long COVID so much, I actually, it's funny because we're not saying that his entire appearance on Joe Rogan was 100% wrong, right? Like he actually says, there's peppered in little bits of truth, and he's right on a few things. And actually, with long COVID, he's pretty right on some of the stuff. So we'll talk about that in a second. And the other thing, I didn't really do this as a clip because he talked about it throughout, but the animal reservoirs, he used the fact that animals get it or pass it, and it's a real mystery as to sort of how that works, because apparently there's no studies or evidence that you can actually catch it from your cat, but they get it at the same time, or deer get it. And it's a bit of, it comes back to the fact that, we don't know a lot here. We don't really know how these viruses transmit that well. We think it's airborne, we're pretty sure, but we don't know exactly what the mechanism is. And, there are people like him that take that and use that to freak out with the fear of the unknown.
Right.
And then there's the rest of us that go, well, that sucks. I wish we would know. We should probably look into it, but let's look at the data. Oh my gosh, thank goodness it's a 99.8% IFR. I'm going to go on with my life with, with precautions.
Right. You and I can say, okay, yeah, somebody should study that. And that's fine. If Michael Osterholm or somebody else wants to study.
Figure it out, please. I'd love to, this
do
animal thing is kind of weird. Let's figure that out.
Do that, but let us move on. Right. And let's
Totally.
don't mask the deer, for heaven's sake.
All right, here he is on long COVID.
Explain what long COVID is technically.
I can't. And the reasons I can't is not because I'm not even an expert, because most people can't. It's a whole series of different conditions: the brain fog, the fatigue, the cardiac involvement, the heart, as we see the heart, the lungs. And it's not really clear what is going on. If you just take a step back, remember before COVID ever existed, we had chronic fatigue syndrome, a real condition, and people were really suffering.
And when you say chronic fatigue syndrome, is that something you can have a test for?
No, that's the whole point,
right.
Is that it was kind of a general term, a catch-all, that basically covered people, and most often it was associated with people who had an infectious disease of some kind, which may have triggered this ongoing immune response. So
is there a specific infectious disease?
Well, Epstein-Barr virus has been often implicated as being a part of this picture. But what it's really pointing out is it's really about this ongoing immune response that we don't yet understand. And I think if there is any area right now that we need tremendous efforts put into, it's long COVID. There are these new centers starting right now to try to address this. Overall, we estimate that there may be anywhere from 3 to 10%, some say as high as 18 to 20% of people, without regard to whether it was serious COVID they had or milder COVID, go on and develop this long COVID.
There's an interesting parallel with fighting. I can talk to you about this with MMA fighters.
Yeah.
That some MMA fighters who have had COVID, particularly ones that didn't. I don't want to speak that I don't want to say that they didn't take it seriously. Maybe they didn't recognize that they needed to rest more and allow themselves to recover, and they trained through it. And guys that trained through COVID-19 tended to suffer long-term consequences from it. There's several examples of this. And after those bouts of COVID-19, there's a thing that happens with fighters at the very highest level. And one of the things that I study with the UFC is I'm studying the elite of the elite athletes, championship level fighters. And just a small drop off of performance is noticeable when they face other elite athletes. And you're starting to see some of these folks that have had COVID-19 then competing and not looking as good 8 months later, a year later, post-infection. And I'm wondering, like, what is this long COVID? Is this like a milder form of long COVID? Because clearly they're in shape, clearly they look great, but when they're competing,
his answer here is good.
Maybe some of them are not quite at the level that they used to be.
Well, I think you raised two very important points. When you asked me earlier about risk of going on and developing COVID and what the long-term impact may be, here you got some of the finest fit people in the world. So that's
why I brought it up.
Yeah, I know. I think the issue around the immune response in the host and things like inflammation, the fact that you can actually find that your body's ongoing activity, and we've seen this with people who, again, it's chronic fatigue, but chronic Lyme disease, people have talked about this kind of same concept. And we really, I think, are at the opening of what I think will be a huge, huge effort to really look more at the long-term impact of immune response on something once it gets triggered. Remember, our immune system is like skating on a razor blade. You want to make sure anything that shouldn't be there, but you want to protect everything you can that's yours, and you don't want anything to happen to it bad. And where that really gets interesting is, for example, in pregnancy, where that fetus is not totally all that mother. But at the same time, the body is working to protect that more than it's done anything ever to make sure nothing bad happens to it. And when that dysregulation occurs, where the immune system tips a little bit more on one side or the other, you can see ongoing problems. And I think that's what this virus is doing, is creating this environment where this ongoing immune response is occurring. And I think and it's not just one thing. It's a series of different issues. But I think the most important message is if anybody listening to this effort here, is that there are people right now working on this, and that this is not something you have to live with, hopefully forever. Looking at
yeah. He seems to have the correct, scientific take on long COVID. It really aligns with sort of what I've uncovered about this and others. And I thought it was interesting, Rogan's personal story, right? And it struck me as a little odd, like, we got to be careful. Like, we all do this, right? We were talking about this before, but his personal experience doesn't necessarily equal scientific data. But Osterholm's point, right, about the inflammation that often occurs from all sorts of viral illness, you never know when it's going to get you. And this is just another one of those. Right.
And I think the point too, Rogan kind of gets at this, like, if you have an infection really of any kind, but you don't completely recover, right? And we're all guilty of this, right? Where you try to get back to work really quickly, or you're just, fatigued for other reasons. Like, if you don't rest and recover, those effects can persist. And then, that's why in the past you would hear people say, I just can't shake this. I can't shake this. And I'm not saying I know all the mechanisms behind that, right?
Sure.
But
it's very common though.
Right. But persistent symptoms after infection is a very normal thing. I think at one point though, Osterholm, where he starts to go off the rails a bit about long COVID, and I can't remember if it was before that segment or after, but he talks about people with very mild, COVID infections who go on to develop really aggressive long COVID. And Rogan
it's people he knows.
It's
people he knows.
Even though anecdotes aren't data.
It was an anecdote. Absolutely.
People he knows. And so Rogan's a little perplexed at that point. He's like, wait a minute, people who weren't really sick with COVID go on to develop long COVID. And he's like, what is that? And so I don't know. I think Osterholm does cite some studies, but not by name. So that's where and like you said, that's Osterholm for you, right? He'll say something that is right on and makes a lot of sense and is supported by data. And then in the next sentences, he'll say something that is completely left field. So it was just hard to listen to for 2.5 hours, that, back and forth, when most of it for me was off in this direction. Right. And panicked.
It was every opportunity that man had to make a point, he skewed it to make it as fearful and as scary as possible. And you got the sense that he felt like that was his job, right? That he was being helpful. And that is profoundly unhelpful. And I think it comes from, again, we've talked about it's the noble lie, but it also comes from a place, in my opinion, of just they don't trust other people. It's a very elitist POV, right? Where you don't trust normal people to get the information and make the right decision on their own. So they must be forced to do what you think is right.
Right. Right. I mean, I think he had three goals coming on. It seems like to say, I don't know. Right. And just to, make sure that people know that scientists don't always know and no expert knows everything. I think that was part of it. To make sure that people know that this isn't over.
Oh, yeah.
Right. This isn't over. And to make sure that people, get vaccinated. Like, I think those were his like three points that he was trying to get to, or that maybe his overlords told him that he needs to get to. I don't know, but that's.
Do you really think he has overlords?
Well, I don't know. I don't know. I'm not saying he's paid by anyone. I don't know. I don't know. Right. I mean, in the spirit of Michael Osterholm, let me just say, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Well, on that note, let's listen to him talk about how humble he is.
Okay.
And
Today, I hope everyone says, Osterholm says, maybe it'll be okay, but maybe it could be another bad one, and we got to be prepared for it. It's that willingness to say, I don't know. I mean, I think probably the three most important words I've said to you all this entire session is, I don't know. And I think that's what we haven't done enough of. And then we have to tell people, so what are we going to do to find out? What do we need to know, to basically answer the question? Well, many of the questions you asked me already. And I think that message is one that we have not done a good job getting out, of just being humble and saying, I don't know.
So in summary.
And just, I mean,
and
yeah,
so
when I
move on
heard
with
that,
your lives, citizens, move on with your lives. That's what I want him to say, right?
Oh my God.
Like, we don't know. We're going to keep studying these things. Most people, 99.99 or whatever % of people who've been infected with this thing survive. Let's move on, and we'll continue to, the scientists and the researchers or whatever will continue to study this, right? Like that. We need a hopeful message, right?
Yeah, and he did say that about long COVID, but here's the problem. A couple of doctors that we know have been talking to, apparently right now there is a federal money fire hose, right, controlled by the science, being shot at long COVID. So right now there are studies for long COVID going on, all sorts of them, and billions and billions and billions of dollars. And long COVID has already been classified as a disability by the feds, which opens all sorts of gates for monetary,
Gates, I think Bill Gates.
Oh my God!
Was that a pun you just did?
Yes. I knew a guy long time ago who was a very interesting fellow. I liked him, but his lifelong ambition was to get on federal disability. And he worked in a job that was semi-dangerous, and he managed to sort of, get in a scuffle a little bit and sued and managed to land disability. And all he does is, sit at home and watch the boob tube and, get his checks come in. He doesn't have to work anymore. That was his life goal. I'm not saying that that's everybody's life goal. We can talk about the safety net and all that sort of stuff, probably a longer conversation. But, this where long COVID is going in our society is concerning.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
But long COVID is also continuing to be used as, a reason, this is the reason that you should get vaccinated, or this is the reason that there's just so much we don't know, and there's severe outcomes. Not, death isn't the only severe outcome, right? And so it continues to push that fear. But yeah, I agree. There's money. You can almost tell where the money is being directed by what their talking points are. I mean, even the study that he mentioned earlier, like he said we're doing a study where we're watching videos of people and how they wear their mask. Like, why are they studying that? Like, what is that study, right? Like, who is funding that study? Is that really something that we need? Is that going to change anything for people?
But also like if that doesn't inform him, to sort of let him know that people just, I'm sorry, it sucks. Like, people aren't just going to do your thing. Like there's a comedy thing, Tom Segura, like he's talking about his famous bit where he goes to a movie theater and there's somebody brought a baby into the movie theater. He goes out and talks to the guy, the manager, and he says, somebody brought a baby in there. You got to go do something about it. And the manager looks at me and goes, man, some people just suck. What do you want me to do about it? And it's like, that's that's the attitude that you need to go through life with. And
Mhm.
the people like Osterholm do not understand that, right?
No.
And somebody does not have to be a deplorable. They do not have to be stupid in order to not necessarily go along with your grand plan.
Right.
And since the beginning of this pandemic, their grand plan, which by the way was throwing out the pandemic playbooks that we worked so hard on,
Mhm.
and adopting this, you know, this Chi-Com, you know, lockdown, you know, test mask model, you know, this completely inhumane, you know, crazy thing that obviously doesn't work. And it would only theoretically work if 100% of the people did it 100% of the time. And they actually think that that's possible.
Right. Right. I mean, and we all have things. I mean, I was trained as an academic. I was in an academic environment for a while. I mean, within my area of expertise, are there things that I would love? So which was education. So are there things that, you know, if I was given the megaphone and money and undue influence, that I would want all schools to do tomorrow, regardless of
Right.
whether do you know what I'm saying? Like
it happens in every
we all want
aspect
to
of
be
our
the master
lives.
of the universe, right? I mean,
Totally.
that's not a good thing, I'm saying, but we all have that. But it seems like that power has been given, at least in part, to people like Fauci, Walensky, Osterholm, and that, like you said, they're narcissists and they don't think twice about what's, you know, what they're focused on zero COVID, and they don't think twice about the, you know, what's happened.
He's
as
a
result.
zero. He's definitely a zero COVID acolyte. I mean, that was his point about Australia and New Zealand. That's what he felt like, that they did great.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
they got the closest to zero COVID, even though that they're, you know, they're islands.
Like this is a competition.
And they abuse
or
their
something.
people.
Yeah. It's crazy.
Good Lord.
All right. Have we exhausted our clips?
We have we
Okay.
solved it though this time,
Yeah,
right?
we solved it. Yeah. I mean, so people can actually watch the whole interview, or they can watch us talk about it for an hour and 20 minutes. So
You know,
we cut your time.
I think it's interesting to watch for the very reasons that we brought up. You know, it's like you know, my BS meter has been honed you know, over the last 2 years. You know, I've become skeptical of literally everything, and I think it's exhausting, but it's also very freeing. And you know, again, I listened to that interview, right? I'm sure you do it the same way, whereas like I don't go in, like I didn't have a super positive view of the guy, but I didn't hate him. Again, right off the bat, he starts in with the panic. But, you know, there were some things that he said were true. So, you know, keep an open mind, you know, be smart about it. But like, oh my God.
Yeah.
This interview was a train wreck, I think.
Yeah, it was a train wreck. But you know what? Like in the spirit of looking at data yourself, right? And seeking out
You can't do
primary
that,
sources.
apparently.
It's
not allowed.
Well, but not letting like the mainstream media or other people do your thinking for you. I would recommend to people that they listen to this interview themselves, and they may have a different opinion. And I'd love to discuss that with people, or say I thought he was really reasonable here, or you know, I disagree with your interpretation of what he said there. I mean, that's what really this is about, and the dialogue. And so I'm grateful to Joe Rogan that he had Osterholm on, and that he has other guests.
Oh, me too.
On.
I'm so glad.
I love that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would never want him to not have done that.
Sure.
Right?
There's other people I want him to have on too. So
yeah,
we'll see. It'll come.
All right.
It'll come.
Well, cool beans.
Good to talk with you.
All right. We'll do this again Friday morning.
Yep. Are we going to have Clayton Cobb on? Have we asked him yet? Maybe I should.
We haven't asked him yet, but
okay.
But we will see.
Our friend Clayton, we'll see. Okay. Sounds
awesome.
good. Enjoy your day.
You too. Bye.